Okay, so this one is called Heartbreaking Columbine High School Massacre, 1999, and this is by True Crime Recaps. I definitely wanted to do this one. I live 30 minutes away from Columbine, down in Colorado. I live in Parker, and Columbine is down in Littleton. So this is definitely one that I always want to do. So let's jump right into it.
On April 20th, 1999, two students walked into their high school in Colorado and unleashed a killing spree that would leave 12 students and one teacher dead. But there's more to the story of Columbine than what you might have heard about Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Today, exactly 23 years later, let's explore one of America's most notorious school shootings, from the lead up to the massacre and the aftermath, to get a better picture of what happened on that fateful Tuesday and why.
It's definitely one of the first big school shootings, so it's a turn of events.
I'm Chris, and this is True Crime Recaps. Before we jump in, you should know that what you're about to hear is extremely disturbing. Now, if a story like this is triggering for you, I understand better than you think. On a personal note, I was at the 2017 Las Vegas festival shooting, the deadliest mass shooting in American history. I'm telling you that because I want you to understand how deeply we empathize with those who were affected by the Columbine tragedy. And like you, we wanted better answers to the who, why, and how something like that could have happened in a high school. Why did Columbine become the blueprint for school shooters? It's not because it was the first like some people think. In fact, it wasn't even the first that year. In May 1998, a 15-year-old killed his parents. The next day, he went to school in Springfield, Oregon, and took 2 more lives and left 25 wounded. He was also wearing a trench coat, just like Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold would be 11 months later. The difference between the two shootings wasn't just the number of victims, it was the why. The Oregon shooter had been hearing voices for years. He thought Disney put a microchip in his head. He did what he did because the voices told him to. Eric and Dylan did it to inspire generations of killers after them. And tragically, they did. No one in the quiet suburb of Littleton, Colorado was prepared for the scale of it. Because of that, some victims were left to fend for themselves inside the school for almost an hour after the first shots were fired. The massacre was plotted and planned for almost a year. The killers recorded themselves discussing who should get the movie rights, Spielberg or Tarantino. They bragged about the torment they would unleash and laughed about the PTSD the survivors would have to endure because of them. They sketched out floor plans of the school and marked up times and places where the most people would be gathered, and by their calculations, if they hit the cafeteria at 11:17 a.m., they could get the most victims. They ran drills and taped their target practices. The fact that more lives weren't lost is a testament to the bravery and quick thinking of the Columbine staff and students.
Something to think about is the parents, like when they went to go to target practice and all stuff, you didn't notice your kids, going out with guns. Like, that's crazy. You just crazy to think. Like, if I see my kid going out, with weapons, I'm questioning, like, hey, what you doing? Why are you doing that? What's your thought process?
Aftermath of that day, the story of why it happened would bend and change. And you've probably heard that Eric and Dylan were bullied mercilessly. Then they snapped. Well, that wasn't exactly true. If you dig a little deeper, you get a different picture. A picture of two teenagers from good homes with a circle of friends at school. And these two guys weren't vulnerable bully bait, but something closer to the bullies themselves. In the fall of their senior year, they threw in with a clique known as the Trenchcoat Mafia. Now, the name pretty much says it all. It was a group of about 10 antisocial kids who wore long black trench coats year-round. They were the ones who didn't fit the mold of the stereotypical all-American teen. But Eric and Dylan didn't really fit in with them either. For one thing, according to writer Dave Cullen, people thought they were nicer. They were more social. They had friends in other cliques. They weren't as radical, or so it seemed. The summer before their senior year, they got a job at a local pizza place. Eric was such a model employee, he was promoted to shift manager. But as fate would have it, one of the trench coat guys worked there too, and the three of them formed a friendship. It's easy to see why. Eric and Dylan liked the F you attitude the trench coat group gave off. At school, Dave Cullen reported that they started identifying as pro-Nazi, idolizing Hitler. And some sources speculate they chose April 20th to attack because it was Adolf Hitler's birthday. Dylan was especially racist and loud about it. Eric was less racist, but more fascinated by the idea of genocide. He entertained himself in class drawing swastikas. Now, this is not the kind of thing that's going to get you voted most popular in the yearbook. It's also not necessarily going to get you shoved into a locker. If anything, people avoided them. Did they feel alienated? Different? Yes. But let's not call them victims. Dylan was 17 and deep in the bell jar. He struggled with paranoia and depression. He was prone to self-harming and thought a lot about suicide. His notebooks included statements like, "I'm an outcast and everyone is conspiring against me." But he also wrote bad poetry about love and heartbreak, complete with drawings of hearts. 18-year-old Eric, on the other hand, was charismatic but manipulative. Like Dylan, he was in advanced classes at school. He'd grown up as a military kid, moving from place to place until they came to Colorado in 1993. And Eric resented being moved around so often. He didn't like being the new kid, and he channeled all those years of frustration and rage into notebooks filled with homicidal fantasies. He even gave them a title, The Book of God. One entry.
What would you do if you found a notebook like this of your kids? One of your kids have a notebook like this and got all this in it. What are you doing? Like, what's the next step? That got to be scary as a parent.
Written 4 months before the attack and published by allthat'sinteresting.com went like this. I want to grab some weak little freshmen and just tear them apart like a fucking wolf. Show them who is God. He acted out his fantasies in video games. Doom was his favorite. It's a first-person shooter game. Eric had been playing it since grade school, and he was deep into it, but it's not like he and Dylan weren't active in school stuff, too. They were. At one point, Dylan ran sound for the drama club, and Eric's older brother was on the football team, and they cheered him on from the stands. 3 days before he opened fire on his classmates, Dylan was at the prom. And here's a horrifying fun fact for you, courtesy of allthat'sinteresting.com. It was his 18-year-old prom date that got them some of the guns in November of 1998.
Oh, wow.
See, that was a loophole in the gun law. You could buy weapons at a gun show without a waiting period. Apparently, the guys researched that specifically and talked her into buying them with a story about using them for deer hunting. Eric was a natural liar. And did they have a special hatred for jocks? Yes and no. We'll dive into that a little deeper in a few minutes, but for now, let me just say this. If this was an attack on the jocks, why didn't they open fire in the gym or during a football practice? Instead, most of the bloodshed was in the library, and not all the people they killed were athletes. That's because this was about notoriety, not some twisted form of Revenge of the Nerds. On April 20th, he and Eric got an early start. At 6:30 a.m., they were at a bowling alley with the rest of their gym class, laughing and joking and bowling some frames, according to Dave Cullen. Looking back, no one would have suspected what would happen hours later. Brooks Brown was one of the first to see Eric pull into a parking spot in front of the school. He talks about what happened next in his book, No Easy Answers. It was mid-morning, not yet noon. Eric was wearing his typical long black trench coat, but that day he had a new accessory with him, a large duffel bag. When Brooks saw him, he gave him a hard time about missing a test that morning. Eric told him it didn't matter. When Brooks continued to poke fun, he says Eric interrupted him and said, "Brooks, I like you now. Get out of here. Go home." The two of them had a complicated friendship. Brooks and Dylan had been close friends in grade school. Then Dylan met Eric in middle school. The three of them started hanging out together during their first year at Columbine in 1995. But by their third year, Dylan and Eric were getting tight, and it was becoming clear that Eric was one twisted nutjob, and Dylan was his easily manipulated partner in crime. A couple of years before the massacre, Brooks' parents filed a suspicious incident report with the sheriff's office, according to acolumbinesite.com. They were concerned because Eric had a web page where he was posting rants about building pipe bombs and killing people. He even had a hit list, and Brooks' name was on it. Apparently, Brooks and Eric lived only minutes away from each other. And when this drama unfolded in their junior year, Eric didn't drive, so he relied on Brooks for rides to school. But Brooks was always running late, which drove Eric crazy. Eventually, after one argument too many, Brooks flat out refused to drive him anymore. So Eric retaliated by throwing a block of ice through his windshield. And to get back at him, Brooks told Eric's dad his son had been drinking, fighting, and vandalizing some houses. Later, Brooks said Eric convinced his dad he was the innocent one and Brooks was the liar. In any case, that's what earned him a spot on Eric's hit list. Interestingly, it was Dylan who gave Brooks the heads up about it, after making him promise he wouldn't tell Eric it was him who told him, of course. When Brooks started getting threatening emails, he told his parents, and they went to the police. But they couldn't prove Eric was behind the threats. Based on the report published in acolumbinesite.com, by the time police went to the URL, the page was gone. And the emails were deleted, but there was some evidence of pipe bombs in the area, which supported the stuff he was writing about online. A search warrant for the Harris house was written up, but for some reason or another, it was never served. Then Dylan and Eric were arrested, but not for making death threats or building bombs. No, they were busted for stealing electronics equipment from a neighbor's van. And since it was their first time on the wrong side of the law, officially, they were placed into a juvenile diversion program. Basically, it was anger management classes and community service. And they did so well in the program, they got glowing reviews. But they were far from rehabilitated. In a report published on acolumbinesite.com, Eric told his therapist he had problems with authority figures, anger, homicidal thoughts, jealousy, mood swings, and more. When he was asked to explain his answers, he wrote, "Short temper, often get angry at anything I don't like people I have no respect for telling me what to do, telling me what to think. I have too many inside jokes and thoughts to have very many friends, or I hate too many things." So, they upped his dosage of Luvox, which is an antidepressant like Prozac and some others. Now let's pause here for a second because, like so many other aspects of this case, the issue of whether or not he was medicated has been hotly debated. And some sources say he stopped taking it before that awful day. Those sources cite toxicology reports that said neither of them had traces of drugs or alcohol in their systems. Other sources say the tox reports show he had therapeutic levels of Luvox, which would mean Eric was still on it when it happened. Either way, 1998 was the year he and Dylan started planning for Judgment Day, as they called it. But before the town's sense of security came crashing down, Brooks and Eric managed to patch things up. But he never forgot how dangerous Eric could be. So when he told him to go home that fateful morning, he did. He was about a block away when he heard the first shots ring out. It was 11:19 a.m. Like most people that day, he thought he was hearing fireworks at first. It didn't take long before he realized he was very wrong. He ran down the street as fast as he could, thinking about the duffel bag Eric was carrying and the fact that he hadn't parked his car in his usual spot. What no one knew until later was that the duffel bag was holding one of many bombs they'd made with propane tanks. By their calculations, the largest number of students would be in the cafeteria at 11:17 a.m. They planted 2 bombs there. Then they parked their cars in the lots flanking the closest entrance and exit. The idea was that the bombs would blow, and when the students ran out, they'd be there with guns waiting. The bombs in their cars were wired to blow later when the first responders showed up. And that's not all. It gets even more diabolical. Another propane bomb and a few pipe bombs were hidden in a field 3 miles away. The pipe bombs exploded at the same time the killers started firing at the high school. It was meant to be a diversion, and it was. But if the propane bomb had exploded like it was supposed to, most of the small suburbs emergency crews would have been dealing with that chaos, giving them more time to wreak havoc at the high school. But the day didn't go according to plan.
Thank God.
After their early morning gym class at the bowling alley, the guys started putting together the bombs. But they were out of their depth and strapped for time, so the detonators were wired wrong, and none of the propane bombs exploded. The shooting rampage was a backup plan, and they were improvising. The first victim was Rachel Scott. She was having lunch with a friend on the grass next to the west entrance. The cafeteria was serving Chinese food that day. It was banned from the menu for years afterwards to avoid triggering memories of that day. Rachel, who was often ridiculed for her devout faith, was shot 4 times. Her friend was shot 8 times in the chest. He survived, but was left partially paralyzed. He later remembered Eric standing over Rachel, asking if she still believed in God. When she said, "You know I do." He said, "Then go be with him," before putting one last bullet in her head.
Crazy.
3 more students who had just stepped out of the
Those
cafeteria
wild
for a
boys.
smoke came under fire. Daniel Rohrbaugh was killed. His 2 friends were critically injured, but miraculously survived. 5 more students were hit. They were outside enjoying the sunshine because the line in the cafeteria was too long. 4 of them managed to take cover in an outbuilding and survive despite horrific injuries. The 5th student, who had been shot 8 times, was too hurt to run, so he played dead, and that's what saved his life. Dylan went inside the cafeteria, but he didn't start shooting at that point. Some reports speculate he was probably wondering why the propane bombs they planted earlier hadn't gone off. From there, he went upstairs where Eric had shot Anne-Marie Holkhalter, wounding and partially paralyzing her. Doctors said her survival was a miracle, but then, tragically, 6 months after Columbine, her mother Carla committed suicide. The trauma was too much for her. As the killers walked towards the west entrance, they continued to throw pipe bombs from their bags onto the grass and roof. Several witnesses heard them say, "This is what we always wanted to do. This is awesome." A teacher, Patty Nielsen, was working as a hall monitor that day when she saw them outside with guns. And she thought they were making some kind of a student film, and she was on her way out to tell them to stop when they shot out the windows, injuring her. A student standing next to her was also injured, but they managed to make their way to the library. Patty screamed for everyone to take cover. Outside in the halls, Eric and Dylan were shooting and throwing pipe bombs. By that time, the fire alarms were going off, but witnesses remember hearing them laughing. Minutes after Patty screamed a warning, Eric and Dylan walked into the library. The massacre in that room lasted 7.5 minutes, but it must have felt like forever for the dozens of students and 4 staff members trapped inside. The first to lose his life there was Kyle Velasquez. He was a mentally challenged, gentle soul who was so confused and scared by the screams and gunfire that he was frozen to his seat at a computer desk instead of hiding under it like the others. Dylan shot him in the back of the head and killed him instantly. Then they yelled, "All the jocks stand up. Anybody with a white hat or a shirt with a sports emblem on it is dead." This is a big part of the reason why the Columbine shootings have forever been synonymous with bullying. I promised I'd explain this aspect of it a little more, so this is a good place to do that. According to the Washington Post, they thought athletes at the school got treated better. They didn't think it was fair that they got away with stuff while other people, presumably like themselves and their friends, got in trouble. So here's an example from the Post article. Apparently, they once saw the school's star wrestler shoving his girlfriend into a locker, and a teacher nearby just let it happen without a word. Another example described a group of football players vandalizing some property without any consequences. And that's the kind of thing they were upset about, but it's ridiculous when you consider what actually happened. Everyone was a target that day, not just the athletes. By this time, the police had arrived on campus. Eric and Dylan shot out the windows in their direction. The police shot back. Surprisingly, no one was injured. Eric walked toward the computer section of the library and shot under the first desk. It hit and killed Stephen Kernow. He was 14, the youngest one to die that day. He then shot under another computer desk, hitting a girl in the shoulder and grazing her neck. When she gasped in pain, Eric said, "Quit your bitching." He moved on to the next set of tables, slapping his hand down, trying to startle whoever was underneath. Then he knelt down and sneered, "Peekaboo." That's where he shot and killed Cassie Bernal. The next to lose their lives were Isaiah Scholes and Matthew Kechter. Both boys were popular athletes. A friend who had been sitting next to them played dead to survive. Eric, filled with adrenaline, screamed, "Who's ready to die next?" They split up then, flanking the tables in the library. As they moved their way around, multiple students were injured and Lauren Townsend was killed. When she died, she had her arms around a friend, soothing her, telling her everything was going to be okay. The friend she tried to protect survived. John Tomlin was also holding a friend's hand, trying to comfort her when he was shot and killed. Kelly Fleming was new to Columbine and spent her lunch periods in the library writing poetry. She died after being shot in the back. Daniel Mauser tried fighting back by pushing a chair in front of Eric, but he was no match for his weapon. He was killed at close range. Interestingly, Daniel's father later told reporters his son was concerned about gun legislation, and the two of them had been discussing the loopholes in the Brady bill just 2 weeks before he was shot by a gun bought at a trade show. one of the loopholes he had questioned. They continued to fire randomly under tables, injuring more students and fatally wounding Corey DePuter. By the time they left, 10 students were dead and a dozen were critically wounded. Scared that the two shooters would return, everyone who was able tried to escape through the north emergency exit door. After going through the school again, throwing Molotov cocktails and checking on the bombs that didn't explode in the cafeteria, Eric and Dylan returned to the library. By then, everyone had escaped except for 2 students who couldn't leave because of their injuries. Eric and Dylan returned fire with the police one last time at 12:05 p.m., according to the Denver Post. 3 minutes later, they killed themselves. At 12:06 p.m., the Post reported the first SWAT team entered the east side of Columbine. They began moving through the school, not knowing the shooters were dead. In fact, there was so much confusion in the smoke and fire alarms that they didn't know how many shooters there were or if hostages were being held. To make matters worse, the school had undergone some remodels, so the layout was unfamiliar. With emergency responders outside, a few students put a sign in a window that read, "One bleeding to death." They were trying to get help for teacher William Dave Sanders, who was bleeding profusely in the science room. Thanks to him, he got hundreds of students in and around the cafeteria out of the school before running towards the gunfire to try and stop the killers. He had managed to crawl into the science room where some students were trying to give him first aid. But because police thought the sign asking for help might be a ruse by the gunman, they didn't get to him in time and he died of his injuries.
Damn.
He was the only teacher to die that day. But the tragedy didn't just end there. While many of the survivors and Dylan Klebold's mother have gone on to write books and speak about what happened, many others are suffering from debilitating PTSD. One former student who witnessed Dave Sanders' death committed suicide. Another student developed an opioid addiction from the medications he took for his injuries. He died of an accidental overdose years later. The effects of such a horrific event reverberate through time, no matter how much time has passed. There is a memorial across the street from the Columbine High School, etched with the names of those who lost their lives that day. At the school, they built a new library to replace the one where so many were killed, and those who remain try to go on as best they can. Daniel Mauser's father helped pass an amendment commonly called the gun show loophole, which now requires background checks to buy a gun at a gun show. And today, all over the country, staff and students are trained on what to do in case of an active shooter. Sadly, like we saw in Parkland, Florida in February 2018, it doesn't always help. 17 more students lost their lives in that shooting, and their killer was inspired by what happened at Columbine. And that's your recap.
Yeah, I think that was a big event in history, definitely with the school shootings. I think a lot of school shooters are influenced by this one. This is like one of the, I feel like the main ones are the biggest one around that time, or that you heard about. I was young, so I learned about it way later, but you still heard about that. And one of the main ones they always reference back to. It's crazy, like I said, living out here. Colorado had a ton of different other shootings too. That's not far from me as well. But you guys jump in the comments. Let me know what you guys think. See you guys on the next one.